Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today it is the 10th of October and today's headlines really are focused on Kursk because of the Russian movement there, mainly by the 155th Marine Brigade. So we're going to begin the video by looking at that. But at the same time, there are important developments around Siversk and further south in Toretsk and Kursk, along with Zaporizhia. So we're going to get into all of that today. I do want to begin though with Kursk because we're going to look at what's verified and what has not been confirmed yet and very clearly differentiate between the two of them. So in yellow, you can see the recent Russian advances that either occurred yesterday or 2 days ago or today at the very least, ever since the recording of my last video, and we have the geolocations to back these ones up. Then there are the other hypothesized advances, which will then mark in red in the future. But just to zoom in, you could see that generally the Ukrainian forces, they have been operating in this rather narrow salient. You could see it just southeast of Korenovo. It's been the case now for over a month. And the Ukrainians here didn't actually have permanent control of settlements like Olgovka or Vetreno to utilize as a forward operating post. They only had chunks of each village, and from there they coordinated. But that's not a sustainable, area where you could hold on to for an extended period of time, especially given the fact that the Russians throughout this 1 month plus time period were just continually building up their forces by moving in certain battalions of VDV units, including from the 109th Division, some also from the 98th Division. There's been very small amounts taken from each one and then moved here, and then combining together, it turns into a rather large force. So that was the buildup. And that's why the Russians, they were comfortable with just letting the front line for a long time sort of just simmer away around the eastern outskirts of Korenovo. Then from there, they were able to reestablish a physical connection between Korenovo and the Glushkovo district. And since then, due to the fact that they've been able to maintain that, their connectivity has really strengthened and it's emboldened them to launch even deeper attacks as we're seeing right now. And so the previous iteration of this was the capture of Obukhovka, and that gave the Russians the perfect buffer and base to conduct even deeper attacks with the objective, as I talked about in earlier videos this past month, would be to cut off the highway that connects between the forward Ukrainian positions right east of Korenovo, which are so critical because for any sort of long-term success for this offensive that the Ukrainians embarked upon in August, they would need to maintain control of this foothold. So at some point in the future, they'd be able to actually assault Korenovo and take it head on. Then you could see that the road connects southwards all the way to Sudzha, and then on the way connects to all of the other local Ukrainian strongholds that are being utilized, either ones that the Ukrainians are digging in on by themselves, or ones that the Russians dug along the border that then were repurposed for Ukrainian use. And so Sverdlikov was a very good example of that, as there's a nearby bunker, and so that really runs through the highway here. It's really the only paved road that can be utilized to connect between all different parts of the Ukrainian positions in Kursk, and now it's cut off in one specific area. So you can see here Russian advance at a minimum of 8.6 square kilometers. It's a push from the previous village taken over by the Russians, Lyubimovka. So there was some back and forth fighting here over the past week. Once the Russians solidified control, they sent in armored assets. Let's actually measure it all the way to the paved road near the village of Novo Ivanovka. So it's about 4 kilometers away. Here you zoom in and you'll see that it's in Zeleny Shdach. And here's the geolocation to indicate that initially you had a Ukrainian tank actually guarding the entrance to this hamlet, and it was forced to withdraw due to 2 Russian APCs coming closer and firing towards it. That's an indication that the Russian forces here were utilizing specifically the vertical road, not the one that comes from the left over here from Lyubimovka. Based on the direction of the video, they were coming in through here. And so they were already present on the highway for a substantial amount of time to then be able to use it as an attack vector from the north to enter into Zeleny Shlech. And then, of course, you have the ancillary attack coming in from the west. So the two-pronged attack allowed the Russian forces to, at the very least, have a presence in the village. But given the fact that it's been, at the very least, several hours since the video was posted, in the time since then, it appears that the Russians would have been able to take control over the rest of this really small settlement, which is then connected in nature to Novo Ivanovka, just due to the fact that you have some roads connecting to it in forested regions. And so now under threats, you have all of the other local villages spread out over here, like Leonidovo and Alexandria. And at this point, it isn't just a matter of cutting off roads, but it's also a matter of cutting off fields because, of course, the paved routes are preferable, but still, you can take solace in the fact that the Ukrainians do have these vast open fields for their armored assets to go through if they want to reach an area like Pogrebki, where there's been a lot of clashes, for instance, or to perhaps go through a narrow corridor and go all the way up to the Koronova region. But that can't really be done if you're also physically cutting off the routes along open fields, or at the very least getting closer and then firing upon those open areas. So that's some of the effect of the current Russian cutting off over here. But that's not all, because there's additional footage showing Russian advances directly east of Koronovo, clearing out areas that the Ukrainians really put a lot of effort into maintaining. So it's an area that probably is around 13 square kilometers. You can see the Russian advance using BTR. So the BTR just advanced along the paved routes. And in the video, the drone footage does indicate that there were several wrecks. It's hard to differentiate because, of course, some of them are actually private vehicles that were utilized by either side, and then it's hard to tell which one was used by which. But then you have some BMPs there, tanks, and so in some cases you can't identify which one it is specifically. 155th Marine Brigade, at least one BTR was passing along these vehicle wrecks, and it was geolocated to this forward area, indicating that the Russians are utilizing this road. And that's where you have sort of the cause and effect, where the implication would be that the Russian assaults started from Koronovo and then branched out along the entire span of the road all the way southwards into the advance that we talked about previously to the south here in Zeleny Shlach. I can't verify that, but the implication would be, if that was actually the case, that all of this region over here marked in the red rectangle would come under Russian control, or at the very least not under Ukrainian control as a result of those advances. Now, based on the geolocation, it's very likely that Vetreno and Matvivka have been taken over, and Russian sources also discuss the entirety of this salient being cleared, but that can't be verified as of now. There's not enough proof for such a large piece of territory. It really is a large, very significant claim to be making. And there are claims, again, that the Ukrainians in turn retreated from these positions due to them being so exposed. For now, none of that can be verified, except for the two advances in yellow that I have marked based on geolocated footage. Besides that, there's also a claim made yesterday, I believe, by Russian sources that they were able to cross over the low-lying gully over here, cross over the rail line, take over the village of Novaya Sorochina. And this would be important because it was done through Kamyshevka, and that it undermines a chain of Ukrainian villages going vertically that includes a really important forward outpost, that being Pogrebki. So if that were to be the case and it's not verified, then you would have the Russian forces, again, undermining another forward Ukrainian position and then having access to roads to advance even further southwards to key areas, specifically Malaya Loknaya. Now, in terms of the elevation here, you have the chains of villages, and that's a pretty good indicator for where you have low-lying valleys. So this is probably the best example where I'm going over with these dotted lines. Those are valley regions, but then also a lot of the open areas or the sparsely populated villages that are in the center of the Ukrainian control in Kursk, they're actually located on a relatively high elevation. So these ridges, they overlook all of the nearby battlefield fronts that you see marked in X, for instance, over here or over here. Even over here in an area that I'm going to zoom up for, over here, like on Kremyannoy, Durovka, Zhuravli, Kalinov, all these villages on the line of contact, those are actually located on ravines that are overlooked by the Ukrainian positions marked in X. So Ukrainians actually have a local elevation advantage from their perspective. Of course, the Russians also have ridges that they, of course, utilize for their own advantage purposes or firing purposes to the north, in between the E30 highway or E38 highway and the current line of contact. So it goes both ways. But now a lot of those ridges will be under threat of coming under Russian capture. And then the big fear is the border between Ukraine and Russia. That's actually on relatively low elevation. So losing those ridges would be horrible for the Ukrainians, because then the Russians, they would have complete domination of the local terrain. It would be utilized to fire onto supply lines leading into Sudzha, and also Sudzha itself, which is located in a river valley. So it is going to be, just by its nature, really compromised to attacks. So you could see how that would affect Sudzha, but also just all the other border outposts that the Ukrainians have tried to retrofit into their own static defense positions. Now, even if there were to be a large-scale Ukrainian withdrawal or they would be pushed back. The hope would be for them that Sudzha would be able to really drag out the fighting for an extended period of time, and by virtue of that, that VDV forces would get tied up in Sudzha, and it would just be this sort of drawn out urban battle. And then, of course, there's various theories, could be used as a negotiating chip, or maybe it's just a part of the broader strategic thinking for the composition of forces. But if that were the case, then a big issue for the Ukrainians is the amount of eggs they put into this basket. We're talking about garrisons of 20, 30K, and some of them actually been diverted now. The Kursk garrison is not only focused on this one particular area, as we all know, they've also moved several battalions westwards to fight in Glushkovo. So not only have forces been moved away from Donbass in a lot of cases to be utilized for offensive activities over here, but then some of the ones that were initially needed for offensive activities in August and then defensive activities ever since, they've been moved to conduct even more offensive activities in a different area a bit further west, several months into the operation, once the Russians were already dug in and prepared for such a potential scenario. And so that decision does mean that the Ukrainian defense, a potential Ukrainian defense within the Kursk region that's under their control, becomes even more difficult when you look at it, because there are several units here that actually are combat capable and would be of good use. 22nd Mechanized Brigade has experience attacking. Now we're going to see if they can defend. 47th Mechanized Brigade, they have extensive experience with defensive activities in Avdiivka. And now, at the very least, their drone elements are operating in the Glushkovo area. We'll have to see if that ends up changing due to the recent events of Russian advances. You have the 225th Assault Battalion, which was previously stationed around the Korenovo area and helped, at the very least, hold on, if not conduct counterattacks. It was moved away, and that was actually a really good use of forces by the Ukrainians to send that battalion over there. So it was moved away recently. You have drone elements of the 116th Brigade and various other smaller forces that were diverted. So it all plays a role at the end of the day. And then also looking at the larger garrison over here, if the goal really was a long-term presence, which is now being undermined, then you're looking at a lot of forces that could have been committed elsewhere. It's not to beat a dead horse because we've talked about it for months now, but you do have several very high-quality units over here, at least on paper. We don't know to what extent they've been attrited. We've talked about the extent to which certain units have been treated, like the 72nd Brigade, because there was very specific information given out about them, but less so about some of these other air assault units. For instance, 82nd Air Assault Brigade is here. They're involved in the defensive activities right now. 80th Air Assault Brigade is also doing that. Ukrainian sources actually claimed that there were 15 vehicle wrecks of Russian BTRs or BMPs, whatever it may be, along the highway as they were conducting their advance. So that has not been verified yet, but it will be a part of general Ukrainian claims being made that they're keeping the situation under control. Really, for now, I would wait to see how it ends up culminating, because really a big threat besides the road being cut off and the physical boundaries being cut off are the elevation advantages that have to be discussed, especially in this X over here. So that would be what I'm keeping my eye on going forward. Now, to zoom in on Siversk, you're going to see here a Russian advance based on a geolocation in the eastern part of Prihorivka. This is news from yesterday, but I couldn't upload yesterday. You can see here it's a video from the 123rd Brigade, and the thing is, in a lot of Russian posts, they refer to it as a 2nd Brigade, but that was the old name of this unit. It actually is an LPR unit called the 123rd Brigade. They raised the flag in eastern Prihorivka. This was actually October 8th. It's indicative of a Russian advance along the Donetsk River bank here, probably around 2 square kilometers. It was done on a rather narrow vector, not necessarily taking over all of Bilohorivka, and so there are very likely positions of the Ukrainian 81st Air Assault Brigade still in bed in this X over here, and same thing would go for the large amount of hills that are located south of Prihorivka, but also north of the Russian spearhead of Verkhnokamianske. And so those regions would be of the utmost priority for the Russians to really clear up before they make any serious efforts to reach the trenches east of Siversk and actually begin the assaults towards there. Same thing with Prihorivka. Prihorivka is actually on rather low elevation. The nearby regions are in hills that the Russians have partially taken over, partially haven't. So that's going to be an advantage for the Russians as they move forward into this village. But Ukrainian sources actually deny that the Russians even have control over Verkhnokamianske. So Petrenko is probably the go-to source that I'm using for the Ukrainian perspective nowadays. Deep State I'm using less so because they're pretty infrequent with their updates. And Petrenko has been doing it pretty regularly, and so they're claiming, at least, that the Russians, they use a drone to drop the flag onto the western edge of Verkhovno-Kamyansk. But at the same time, there hasn't been any proof of the Ukrainians present in the village, which I feel it would be pretty easy to verify their presence if they actually were here. And also, there were news reporters, Russian news reporters. The exact geolocation wasn't clear, but they were generally in this village. And so I'm just not sure about that. Like, I'm not going to discount the entire possibility that the Russians aren't in control of Verkhovno-Kamyansk, but I think there needs to be more proof to disregard what we've seen so far. And given the yellow movements, the yellow polygons, you could see how it's being shaped in a way where the Russians are trying to squeeze the Ukrainians out of their very favorable positions, whether it be in Bilohorivka, where they do have a very strong defense apparatus, or to the west in the hilly region. Also to the south, you have this bulge, which is a rather high elevated region, which could feasibly be squeezed, the Ukrainians can be squeezed out of. Then you have the eastern edge of Siversk. There is a local hill northeast of the city, which is important for domination of the valley on which Siversk is on. So that's important to take control over. And then more generally, going westwards, there is this ridge sort of branching out of the western outskirts of Siversk. And so there are a lot of higher elevated regions for support for the Ukrainians, but Siversk itself, where they're actually going to have to defend eventually, that region is very compromised based on its geographic location. This also would be that the Ukrainians did have 2 years to build up trenches in this region, so the eastern bank is relatively fortified. The southern flank, though, this is an area that is potentially compromised, so I'd be interested to see if the Russians do make efforts to harass the southern flank. Looking at Toretsk, you could see here large Russian advances into the majority of the Sabalka district, which is located south of Toretsk proper. It's largely located on a lower elevated region. But just to look at the way in which we know of this advance, it's from a Voron unit, so that's a part of the 100th Brigade. They released this FPV drone compilation, one of the geolocations from October 8th. So there were FPV strikes on those small squads. And based on those locations, the argument could have been made that the Russians advanced through two very specific vectors, one of them from the south, which I'll mark with the arrow over here. So coming in from positions that had already been taken over in the southern portions of this forested region, and then, going in from there, working their way into the western portions of the district, and then also coming in from the north along the locations in central Toretsk, moving southwards through the dachas, and then going into the Sabalka itself. And so there was, of course, a possibility that there were still Ukrainian forces located here, or a gray zone within eastern Sabalka and the large portions of this forested region. But in the days since, we haven't seen any indication of the Ukrainians being located here. And you also had reports by Russian sources where they claim that this entire region is marked under their control. So perhaps I'm wrong, and if I'm wrong, then I'll change it to indicate there may still be a large gray zone filled within this void. But the important thing to note is that the security and the line that was built over here, that was able to hold out for over a month, for several weeks, in addition to that, it has not been broken either directly through the east or also through northern and southern axes. Either way, it is significant because now a large chunk of Zabalka is under threat of being taken over by the Russians completely. What this means is that you could have the Russians completely circumvent all of these perimeter defenses that were built by the Ukrainians and actually attack them head on. And they're already in a sort of compromised position because a large portion of the Nelipivka and Leonidivka region is in a gray zone. And so these fortified regions, they may be under threats from a completely different axis than they imagined originally. Also, advancing through the Zabalka district would give the Russians access to these really important slag heaps that completely dominates, even more than the Citadel, completely dominate the downtown regions of Toretsk that are still under their control, that you could see marked with these red rectangles over here, like Krimske or just northern Toretsk in general. So that is, of course, very important. And the Voron compilation that you see marked over here, it includes this 1.3 square kilometer region, which shows a further Russian advance slightly northwards into Krimske itself. So it's also running along the same sort of ridge that sort of stops in the central Toretsk around the various citadel regions, and then also expands westwards, or eastwards, I should say, from there into Pivnishnya and the suburbs of Toretsk. Looking at Sukronia, we could see further Russian advances based on reports from Ukrainian sources and Russian sources alike. Here, just north of it, along the rail line, you have Russian advances continuing. So this is from the 15th Brigade National Guard unit. They dropped grenades onto Russian forces operating in the windbreaks just south of Selydove. This is important because you could see how the battlefield is being shaped in a way wherein the Russians are advancing both along this ravine, this really narrow ravine, but it also leads into an area of Selydove that is a bit less dense and it would actually be easy to enter into. It's not that fortified, and it's also on the rear of where the current fighting is going on. And then at the same time, this sort of parallel attack coming in from the windbreak region that could reach this paved road and then also get into the western entrance to Selydove. So that's the way the Russians are going about their attacks here. They're not necessarily focusing on attacking head on, and it does make sense given the density of the Ukrainian defense along the line of contact. Further southwards into Crimea, you could see that there were 2 layers of Russian advances over the past couple of days. That entails the capture of the entire eastern portion of the village and then actually crossing over into the western area past the rail line. So what remains in a gray zone right now is really just some of these houses over here, and then the warehouses are under the control of the Ukrainians. So now the Russians really are in the final process of clearing up this region. There was a bit of confusion, but I do believe that the 112th Kiev Territorial Defense Brigade is actually located in the Kharkiv region. It's involved with just general defending in some of those villages near the Kupiansk sector specifically. And previously I had a presence just to the north of the Pokrovsk front, so I was involved in some of the lower level defending, and it does make sense given the fact that it is a territorial defense unit. And it was stationed around this region over here, marked in X. It does appear that they have not actually been moved to defend in Sukhurnia, but actually they've been moved to defend sometime over the past couple of weeks in that region in Kharkiv itself. Now looking at Robotyne here, we have actually a report coming in from deep states. You can see that the indication is here Russians getting control over 2.6 square kilometers of territory. This would include the entirety of the perimeter over here of this paved road. This paved road was really important initially for the Russian defense structure. A lot of the trenches here, they're not connected to the Surovikin line by any means, but they were really well developed. And ever since, the Ukrainians have also expanded upon that work with their own dugouts, and now the Russians have been able to fully clear it out after a year of just working on these shaping operations to squeeze out the remaining Ukrainian small squads from the hinterlands between Verbove and Robotyne. So now you have just a large chunk of fortifications taken over by the Russians, and the line sort of stabilizing. I suppose that there is still a more wide salient in this region over here marked in X. Again, it's not a massive Russian priority, but it is an area that could in the future become compromised based on the fact that Russian flanks have proven to be potent in squeezing out these sort of Ukrainian pockets here in the past. But again, most of the fighting in the Zaporizhia region that I find to be interesting is going on right now around Kamyanske, where Ukrainian sources do discuss the presence of DRGs within certain portions of the northern section of the village. Not the entirety of the village, though, based on the geolocated footage at least, which came out over the past 3 days and I just didn't cover, so that's my bad. It's an advance of around 2.2 square kilometers. And you could see it actually marked over here with some of these videos, October 6th, and this one is from, let's see, October 8th, and it shows the 3rd Special Purpose Regiment conducting FPV strikes. That regiment, it's been present in several really high-profile battles, specifically around Avdiivka, but that was over half a year ago now. So they really do move based on where they're needed most, and it appears now they have some sort of operation going on over here near the Dnipro River. And so, yeah, that's all I have for today. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.